The children of Nazi leaders were born into a world of power and privilege. While their parents sowed chaos, they lived surrounded by luxury, shielded from reality. The Third Reich offered them a life like no other, far removed from the horrors the regime inflicted on millions. But with the collapse of the Reich, their world crumbled. What was once synonymous with greatness became an unbearable burden. The children of the architects of Nazism were cast into the shadow of a history they never asked for. Some fled, others clung to the legacy, but all were marked by the weight of a surname impossible to forget. What happened when the war ended and the myths fell? How did they confront the truth about their parents and the world they built? Were they able to break free from their inheritance, or were they doomed to bear the burden of their legacy? Poisoned childhoods, privilege, blind faith, and the factory of hate. The childhood of the children of the Nazi elite unfolded in a parallel universe, an artificially constructed microcosm that reflected the regime's distorted vision of the world it sought to impose. This sealed and privileged bubble created a cognitive dissonance that would deeply affect their psychological development and their later ability to process historical truth. In the villas and mansions of the Nazi high command, a singular generation grew up, the children of the architects of the Third Reich. These families lived in tightly controlled environments where National Socialist ideology dominated every aspect of daily life. Children born into these exceptional circumstances enjoyed unparalleled privileges while remaining unaware of the atrocities orchestrated by their parents. The authority structure in these families often mirrored the hierarchical principles of the regime. The father held an unquestionable position, demanding absolute loyalty in both public and private spheres. This transfer of authoritarian principles into the domestic space created an environment where critical questioning was virtually impossible. Albert Speer's daughter Hilda described this parallel. "My father's word was law. Questioning his decisions or judgments was unthinkable, not only because he was my father, but because he represented an extension of national authority." Karinhal, Hermann Göring's extravagant estate, represented the epitome of extreme privilege. There, little Edda Göring, born in 1938, lived among unimaginable luxuries in a complex that encompassed thousands of hectares of forest where bison, deer, and wild horses roamed freely. The rooms overflowed with artwork looted by her father, who declared himself the Reich's artistic patron. The estate included a private cinema, gym, swimming pool, bunker, and a reception hall over 900 square meters in size called the Hunting Hall. To Edda's delight, lion cubs were raised and replaced yearly once they reached 1 year of age. The little girl embodied the Aryan ideal of beauty and was constantly photographed and celebrated in the German press. Hitler himself was her baptismal godfather, an event celebrated with great pomp in November 1938. The propagandistic instrumentalization of these families added another layer of complexity to their internal dynamics. The constant media exposure created a divide between public identity and private intimacy, generating dissociative thought patterns that would later complicate the integration of contradictory experiences. Gudrun Himmler, daughter of Heinrich Himmler, was born in 1929 and perfectly embodied the ideal of the Aryan girl. Her father, one of the most feared men in Germany as head of the SS, displayed a remarkably paternal side toward her. He affectionately called her Puppy and kept daily contact by phone when home, sending weekly letters when traveling. This duality, the architect of the Holocaust who simultaneously showed deep paternal affection, created a cognitive dissonance that would mark Gudrun's adult life. For Gudrun, as for many of these children, family loyalty was inextricably entwined with ideological loyalty. Her intense filial love for Heinrich Himmler was inseparable from her commitment to the ideology he represented. Any questioning of National Socialist principles was implicitly interpreted as a betrayal not only of a political abstraction, but of the fundamental father-daughter bond, which explains why, for some descendants, breaking with their paternal legacy felt emotionally equivalent to a symbolic parricide. Gudrun's diary, partially recovered after the war, offers disturbing glimpses of this parallel reality. In a 1941 entry during a visit to Dachau with her father, the 12-year-old girl wrote, "Today we visited the camp where Papa works. It's very big and the men seem very orderly. Papa says they work for Germany. There were many flowers at the entrance and everything looked very clean. This childlike perception, carefully shaped by paternal supervision, reveals the effectiveness of the reality filter imposed on these children. The Goebbels children lived under the constant scrutiny of the propaganda machine, presented as the ideal Aryan family. Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holder, Hedwig and Heidrun, all bearing names starting with H in honor of Hitler, appeared regularly in magazines and newsreels. Their education and social activities were meticulously designed to exemplify Nazi virtues. Despite this public exposure, in private, Joseph Goebbels, contrary to his stoic public image, was described by household staff as a playful father who enjoyed organizing elaborate treasure hunts for his children and reading them bedtime stories, often traditional German tales adapted to include anti-Semitic messages. Rudolf Höss, the commander of Auschwitz, maintained a pleasant home just outside the perimeter of the extermination camp, where he played with his children and tended his garden. What the little ones didn't know was that their father had likely signed death sentences for other children that very day, or personally overseen the gassing of hundreds of Jews before returning home for dinner. Brigitte Höss, daughter of Rudolf, would recall decades later, "He was the ideal father. He never yelled at us, never punished us. Every night he would sit by my bed and we would talk about what happened during the day, my studies, my friends. He sang us songs and told us stories." This testimony from the daughter of the Auschwitz commander perfectly illustrates the psychological compartmentalization that characterized these households, where paternal tenderness coexisted with systematic brutality. In homes where systematic violence was the father's professional occupation, the lines between family discipline and abuse were often blurred. Several descendants later reported experiences of extreme physical punishment presented as character building. Nicholas Frank described disciplinary methods that today would be recognized as child abuse. "My father believed resistance to pain built character. He deliberately exposed us to situations of extreme fear to harden our spirit," he recalled. Educational refugees, the elite schools of National Socialism. Among the key institutions for indoctrinating the children of the Nazi elite were the Napolas, Nationalpolitische Erziehungsanstalten, or National Political Education Institutes, and the Ordensburgen, fortified academies specifically designed to train the future leaders of the Reich. These centers represented the most refined educational manifestation of National Socialist ideology. The Napolas, established from 1933 under the direct supervision of the SS, were elite boarding schools that combined rigorous physical and military training with strict ideological formation. Children of high-ranking officers and prominent Nazi party members were given admission priority, creating an exclusive and sealed educational environment. The admissions system at these institutions reflected the regime's racial obsessions. Candidates had to undergo exhaustive physical exams to verify their racial purity, measuring everything from skull proportions to the distance between the eyes. Horst von Wechter, son of the Nazi governor of Galicia Otto von Wechter, later described this process as a combination of medical exam and initiation ritual, where we were measured as if we were purebred livestock. Edda Goering, though too young to attend a Napola before the regime collapsed, was destined to study at the Landschulheim am Solling, an elite boarding school. By the age of 7, she already showed the effects of intensive indoctrination. An Allied officer who interrogated her in 1945 noted that the girl could recite Nazi propaganda with unsettling precision and displayed a disturbing pride when speaking of her godfather, Hitler. For adolescents, the Adolf Hitler schools, Adolf Hitler Schulen, founded in 1937, offered an even more exclusive environment. Helga and Hildegard Goebbels, the eldest daughters of the propaganda minister, briefly attended one of these institutions. Their diaries, partially discovered after the war, reveal how these institutions systematically shaped their perception of reality. Helga wrote in a 1943 entry, "Today we learned why we must stay pure. Teacher Maya showed us pictures of inferior races and their defects. I am grateful to have been born German." The curriculum at these institutions focused almost exclusively on eugenics and racial theories. Biology was used to teach the supposed scientific basis of the Nazi racial hierarchy, presenting pseudoscientific theories of Aryan superiority as objective facts. Math included practical problems related to military expenses or calculations of the economic burden posed by unproductive populations. History was entirely rewritten, presenting Germany as the historical victim of Jewish conspiracies. The testimony of Wolf Rüdiger Hess, who attended a Napola in Bavaria, illustrates the psychological impact of this education. We grew up convinced of our natural superiority. The constant physical testing and ruthless competition created an atmosphere where showing weakness was unforgivable. Only years later did I understand how distorted our training had been. For girls, education was complementary but distinct. Female institutions, such as the elite schools of the League of German Girls, emphasized preparation for roles as mothers and wives of future leaders. While boys were trained to command, girls learned to be perfect guardians of the Aryan home. The model of femininity imposed was extremely restrictive, with socialization focused on future motherhood as a service to the nation. Racial ideology permeated even the most ordinary activities. Dolls were used to practice maternal care for the next Aryan generation, and sewing classes were framed as preparation to properly dress the future soldiers of the Reich. Ilse Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess and mother of Wolf Rüdiger, expressed this vision in letters to educators of the League of German Girls. The young German girl must understand that her body is a racial sanctuary, her future motherhood a service as valuable to Germany as a man's military service. This objectification of the female body as a national reproductive vehicle would have profound consequences on these girls' self-perception during adolescence and adulthood. For younger children, even recreational activities were infused with ideological content. Toys, fairy tales, and popular games in the homes of the Nazi elite reflected and reinforced the regime's values. Ariane dolls, specifically manufactured for girls from select families, featured pronounced Nordic traits. Board games like Juden raus, Jews out, normalized anti-Semitic persecution. A distinctive feature of these children's education was the systematic elimination of critical thinking and dissent. Albert Speer Jr., son of Hitler's architect, would later recall, "The indoctrination was so complete that it never occurred to us to question what we were taught. Truth was a top-down imposition, not something to be discovered through questions. That was perhaps the most lasting damage of our education, the atrophy of our capacity for independent thought." The collapse of delusion, ritual suicides, and the final fall. April 1945 marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. With the Red Army advancing from the east and the Western Allied forces penetrating from the west, the artificial world that had protected the children of the Nazi elite began to violently disintegrate. High-ranking families faced desperate decisions that would determine the fate of their children. In Hitler's underground bunker, the most harrowing tragedy unfolded when Joseph and Magda Goebbels made an unimaginable decision. While Soviet artillery explosions thundered on the surface, the 6 Goebbels children spent their final days confined in the stifling underground complex. Witnesses like Traudl Junge, Hitler's personal secretary, later described the behavior of the Goebbels children during those final days. Helga, the eldest at 12, seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation and showed visible signs of anxiety, refusing to sing the patriotic songs she had once enthusiastically performed. Heidrun, the youngest at just 4 years old, played innocently with dolls in a corner of the bunker, completely unaware of the imminent catastrophe. Albert Speer offered to evacuate the children to safety, but Magda, in a disturbing display of ideological fanaticism, rejected all such offers. She and Joseph had decided to die alongside their Führer, and in their distorted mindset, their children could not live in a world without National Socialism. On May 1, 1945, with Soviet troops only blocks away, they executed their macabre plan. Rokus Misch, the bunker's telephone operator, recalled his last glimpse of the children, seated around a table in their nightgowns while Frau Goebbels brushed their hair. Dr. Helmut Kunz, an SS dentist, sedated the children with morphine injections. Once unconscious, Magda Goebbels and Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, Hitler's personal physician, crushed cyanide capsules in their mouths. In a final act of disturbingly distorted maternal care, Magda arranged the lifeless bodies of her children in their beds, carefully brushing their hair and adorning the girls with ribbons. She left a letter to her eldest son from a previous marriage, Harold Quandt, attempting to justify her actions. The world that comes after the Führer and National Socialism is no longer worth living in, and that is why I have taken the children with me. Joseph and Magda committed suicide shortly thereafter. Meanwhile, other children of the Nazi elite faced different fates. The Göring family had sought refuge at their mountain residence in Obersalzberg. Hermann Göring, aware of the imminent defeat, ordered Karinhal to be dynamited after transferring his valuable art collection. When captured by American forces, Edda and her mother were interned at the Palace Hotel in Luxembourg, a shocking contrast to the luxurious settings they had been accustomed to. After Heinrich Himmler was captured by British forces, Gudrun and her mother Margaret were detained by American troops while trying to escape to South Tyrol. They passed through several interrogation centers, ending up in Nuremberg, where Margaret was searched and a vial of potassium cyanide was found sewn into the padding of her coat's shoulder. During interrogations, the 16-year-old Gudrun showed unwavering loyalty to her father, surprising even seasoned interrogators. An American officer noted in his report, "Himmler's daughter shows an exceptional level of indoctrination even by Nazi youth standards. She categorically rejects any accusation against her father and maintains that the atrocities are Allied propaganda. Her conviction is so absolute that it is disturbing." The Bormann family experienced an abrupt fragmentation when Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful private secretary, disappeared during the fall of Berlin. His children were left helpless and faced intense scrutiny due to their father's prominent role in the Nazi regime. The youngest Bormann children, Martin, Adolf, and 7 other siblings, were initially taken in by Catholic families unaware of their true identities. This traumatic separation, combined with the uncertainty surrounding their father's fate — his remains would not be identified until 1972 — created a deep identity void. Rudolf Höss temporarily escaped after the war, but was eventually captured, tried, and executed in 1947. His children had to flee northward by car, traveling at night with headlights off under constant Allied bombing. Höss had considered family suicide and had obtained the fatal doses of poison in case of capture by the Russians, but ultimately abandoned the idea for the sake of the children. For Adolf Eichmann, one of the main architects of the Holocaust, escape meant family abandonment and later reunification in exile. In 1948, he obtained a landing permit for Argentina and false documentation under the name Ricardo Clement. His family later joined him in Buenos Aires. Klaus Eichmann, his eldest son, had served in the Waffen-SS and fully shared his father's ideological convictions. After reuniting with him in Argentina, he actively participated in South American neo-Nazi circles and helped establish support networks for other Nazi fugitives. This case illustrates how, for some already adult and indoctrinated children, the collapse of the regime did not necessarily entail an ideological break, but rather the clandestine continuation of their convictions. The false normality, domestic life in the families of genocide. One of the most disturbing aspects in the history of the children of Nazi leaders is the juxtaposition between the apparent normality of their everyday family life and the atrocities in which their fathers were actively involved. This duality created a deep cognitive dissonance in these children. Diaries, letters, and later interviews reveal domestic patterns that, on the surface, might seem conventional. Heinrich Himmler maintained a meticulous family routine. Even during the most intense years of the Holocaust, he set aside time to review Gudrun's schoolwork and sent her carefully chosen gifts from his inspection trips to concentration camps. A letter dated September 1943, sent by Himmler to Gudrun for her birthday, illustrates this unsettling duality. "My dear Puppy, I'm sorry I can't be with you on your birthday. I'm sending you this brooch I found on my last trip to Warsaw. It's old silver and has the Nordic details you like so much. Remember to practice your piano as you promised. Papa is very busy working for Germany, but he always thinks of you." The old silver most likely came from the recently liquidated Warsaw Ghetto, and the work for Germany included overseeing the systematic extermination of Polish Jews. Family photographs recovered from the period show disturbingly ordinary scenes. Hermann Göring teaching little Edda to ride her pony on the grounds of Karinhal, Martin Bormann tossing his children in the air amid laughter on the terrace of the Berghof, Reinhard Heydrich playing the violin for his children before bedtime. These images of seemingly idyllic domesticity were often captured on the same day these men signed extermination orders. The family residences themselves represented spaces of moral contradiction. The Höss home, located just outside the perimeter of Auschwitz, was described by the children as a childhood paradise with its fruit orchard and farm animals. From the garden, however, the smoke from the crematoria was visible. According to later testimony from Klaus Höss, the children had completely normalized this site, interpreting it through their father's explanations as bread ovens or disinfection facilities. This physical proximity between idyllic family life and genocidal machinery reached its most extreme expression in the case of Armin Goeth, commander of the Poisson concentration camp. From the balcony of his villa, where his lover Ruth Irene Calder hosted elegant dinners, Goeth would capriciously shoot prisoners for entertainment. His daughter Monica, born in 1945, would grow up without knowing her father, executed in 1946, but would eventually discover with horror this macabre juxtaposition. The terrace where family photos were taken was the same space from which her father shot innocent human beings. Family rituals served as anchors of normality in morally devastated environments. Höss insisted on formal family dinners where school and cultural topics were discussed, meticulously avoiding any mention of the work he carried out just meters away. Albert Speer organized Sunday hiking expeditions with his children in the Bavarian Alps, creating idyllic memories that would later contrast brutally with revelations about his involvement in forced labor and the exploitation of prisoners. Christmas celebrations deserve special mention for their symbolic weight and emotional intensity. Christmas in homes like those of the Himmlers or Heydrichs incorporated a strange fusion of Christian traditions with the pagan ritualism promoted by the SS. The gifts received by these children often had sinister origins: toys manufactured by concentration camp prisoners, clothing made from confiscated belongings, crafts created under duress by interned Jewish artists. The psychosexual dimension of development in these environments deserves particular attention. The paradoxical combination of public puritanism and private permissiveness characteristic of many Nazi leaders created domestic settings with frequent contradictions. While a conservative sexual morality was officially promoted, several Nazi elite households displayed highly dysfunctional dynamics: normalized paternal infidelities, constant objectification of female figures, and in some cases overtly abusive behaviors. For the children, this duality created a kind of split reality they would later have to reconcile. The image of the loving father who helped with homework or played in the garden would eventually have to confront the same man signing extermination orders or overseeing mass executions. This moral disjunction partially explains the polarized responses many developed in adulthood, from obstinate denial to visceral rejection of the paternal figure. Born guilty, the cursed inheritance of a name that weighed like a sentence. The immediate post-war period represented a brutal awakening for the children of Nazi leaders. The Germany that emerged from the ruins of the Third Reich was a physically devastated and morally traumatized country. For these youths, many barely teenagers, the transition was especially violent. Their surnames went from being revered to becoming synonymous with infamy and evil. The first years after 1945 were marked by hunger, displacement, and social chaos. The families of Nazi officers, previously shielded from the hardships of war, suddenly found themselves vulnerable and exposed. Edda Göring and her mother, following the arrest of Hermann Göring and his subsequent suicide on the eve of his scheduled execution, went from living in luxurious mansions to occupying a cabin without electricity or running water. For the children of prominent figures such as Himmler, Göring, Frank, or Höss, identity became an unbearable burden. At school, these children faced constant bullying, social isolation, and open hostility. Many chose to change their surnames or adopt their maternal family names. Brigitte Höss, deeply ashamed of her father's crimes as commander of Auschwitz, eventually left Germany, settled in the United States under a veil of anonymity, and vowed never to speak of her history. For more than 60 years, she kept her secret until she finally agreed to an interview in 2013, shortly before her death, on the condition that her adopted name and exact location not be revealed. Brigitte's testimony offers invaluable insights into the psychological survival strategies developed by these children. I learned to compartmentalize my life. My childhood in Auschwitz was sealed in a mental box that I rarely opened. I built a new person with a new story. Over time, I almost came to believe that this invented person was me. This capacity for dissociation, initially developed as a defense mechanism, became a permanent survival strategy for many. The denazification process imposed by the Allies directly affected these families. Properties were confiscated, bank accounts frozen, and job opportunities severely restricted. Emmy Goering, once a respected actress, was sentenced to 1 year in prison after the war, with 30% of her assets seized by the Allied government and a 5-year ban from performing. The denazification courts established by Allied authorities categorized German citizens into 5 groups, from major offenders to exonerated. The families of Nazi leaders automatically fell into categories that carried significant restrictions, including limits on residence, employment, and education. Gudrun Himmler, for example, was rejected from multiple university programs due to her surname, despite her outstanding academic record. The education of these youths required a complete ideological reorientation. Having grown up under intense Nazi indoctrination, they now had to adapt to a reformed educational system that emphasized democratic values and explicitly condemned the Nazi regime. This re-education, necessary yet traumatic, involved fundamentally dismantling beliefs instilled during their formative years. The educational programs implemented by the occupying authorities included mandatory screenings of documentaries about concentration camps, visits to exhibitions on Nazi crimes, and completely revised curricula that eliminated all National Socialist influence. For many young people, this radical change represented a form of cognitive violence. Psychologically, these youths faced the dual task of processing the collapse of their known world and reconciling the image of a loving father with that of a war criminal. This cognitive dissonance proved particularly devastating. Nicholas Frank, son of the notorious Governor-General of occupied Poland, described how his initial shame over his father evolved into a burning, obsessive hatred as he discovered the detailed actions of Hans Frank. The Nuremberg trials and subsequent proceedings forced these young people to confront uncomfortable truths. Gudrun Himmler, then a teenager, was called to testify alongside her mother. The public spectacle of their parents being tried, convicted, and in many cases executed added another layer of trauma to their already complicated lives. Family dynamics changed dramatically, especially in homes where the father figure had been executed, imprisoned, or had disappeared. Mothers, many of whom had previously been confined to traditional domestic roles under the Nazi ideal of femininity, were forced to become primary breadwinners and protectors in a hostile environment. Ilse Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess and mother of Wolf Rüdiger, exemplifies this adaptation. After her husband's imprisonment in Spandau, she worked as a secretary and translator while simultaneously leading campaigns for her husband's release and shielding her son from social stigma. The maternal figure gained crucial relevance during this period. While some mothers like Margaret Himmler or Emmy Goering remained loyal to their husbands' ideological convictions, passing this loyalty on to their children, others like Henriette von Schirach, wife of Nazi youth leader Baldur von Schirach, actively broke with the past and promoted the integration of their children into the new democratic society. Loyalty in the shadows, children between denial and moral rupture. In the decades following the war, the children of Nazi leaders followed remarkably divergent paths, largely determined by how they chose to relate to the toxic legacy of their fathers. Some opted for radical rupture, others for stubborn defense, and some navigated an ambiguous territory between family loyalty and acknowledgement of atrocities. Gudrun Himmler represents the most evident case of unwavering loyalty. After the war, she dedicated her life to preserving and rehabilitating the memory of her father, Heinrich Himmler. She joined Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, a clandestine organization that supported arrested, convicted, or fugitive SS members. Gudrun's determination to defend her father's legacy reached nearly obsessive dimensions. She meticulously kept every newspaper clipping or publication that mentioned Heinrich Himmler, annotating the margins with detailed refutations of what she considered Allied lies. In 1961, Gudrun married Wolf-Dieter Burwitz, an official of the far-right NPD, National Democratic Party of Germany. adopting his surname but never abandoning her identity as Himmler's daughter. She proudly wore a silver brooch her father had given her, depicting 4 horse heads arranged in the shape of a swastika. Known in neo-Nazi circles as the Nazi princess, Gudrun regularly attended clandestine meetings of former SS officers and maintained ties with those who had once fought for Germany until her death in 2018 at the age of 88. German journalist Oliver Schromm, who interviewed her in 1992, described her home as a private museum of Nazism, with framed photographs of her father in uniform and SS objects carefully preserved. "What is most disturbing," wrote Schromm, "is not her denial of the Holocaust, but her absolute conviction that the Nazi regime represented the culmination of German civilization, a golden age brutally interrupted by external forces." In stark contrast, Nicholas Frank chose to openly confront his father's crimes. As a respected journalist in Germany, he used his platform to denounce the atrocities of the Nazi regime. In 1987, he published Der Vater, eine Abrechnung, The Father, a Reckoning, a book in which he denounced his own father as a psychopath and stated he deserved to be executed. Nicholas's break with his father's legacy was total and public. In lectures and interviews, he described Hans Frank as a monster of incomprehensible cruelty, a refined mass murderer who signed extermination orders while listening to Mozart. This stance provoked fierce criticism, especially from other Nazi children like Klaus von Schirach and Martin Adolf Bormann, who considered his judgment excessively harsh. His own siblings never forgave him for writing the book and cut off all contact with him. Martin Bormann Jr., the eldest son of Hitler's powerful secretary, followed a path of spiritual transformation. Baptized with Hitler as his godfather, young Martin grew up at the heart of Nazi power. However, after the war, he embarked on a journey that led him to the Catholic Church. On July 26, 1958, he was ordained a priest, a transformation that represented a definitive rejection of his father's ideology. Between 1961 and 1964, he worked as a missionary in the Congo, ministering to the needy and spreading a message of love and compassion diametrically opposed to the doctrines of hate from his youth. This vocational choice represented the most radical form of rupture with his paternal inheritance. While Martin Bormann Sr. had served as an administrative facilitator of genocide, his son dedicated his life to serving the most vulnerable. Despite his efforts to atone for his father's actions, Martin Bormann Jr. found himself trapped in a complex web of emotions. In a moving statement made in 2000, he revealed, "I love him as my father and hope to meet him as a redeemed and saved man. But I cannot absolve him of any of the guilt he accumulated in his political life by following Adolf Hitler." Albert Speer Jr., son of Hitler's architect and later Minister of Armaments, chose to follow his father's profession while distancing himself from his ideology. In a 2010 interview with Süddeutsche Zeitung, he explained, "I've tried all my life to separate myself from my father, to distance myself. This strategy allowed him to be valued for his own merits and not as Albert Speer's son. He developed a strong reputation as an architect and urban planner, working on high-profile international projects. In a sense, Albert Jr.'s professional path represented a form of indirect redemption. While his father had designed monumental buildings to glorify the Third Reich, the son specialized in sustainable architecture and humanist urban planning. Nevertheless, critics noted the persistence of certain shared traits: fascination with large-scale projects, megalomaniacal ambitions, and a willingness to work with contemporary authoritarian regimes such as China. Even in his break with his father's legacy, Albert Jr. displayed traces of continuity that he himself acknowledged with ambivalence. Rolf Mengele, son of the infamous Angel of Death of Auschwitz, faced a late and traumatic revelation about his father's true nature. Raised far from Auschwitz and fed misinformation, Rolf grew up believing his father was a war hero. In 1977, he traveled to South America to confront Josef Mengele directly. What he found was not a remorseful soul seeking forgiveness, but an unrepentant Nazi attempting to justify his actions. This transformative encounter with his father in Brazil, later documented in his memoirs, represents one of the most valuable testimonies on the psychology of Holocaust perpetrators. Josef Mengele, then hiding in Sao Paulo under a false identity, tried to justify his medical experiments as necessary contributions to science and described Auschwitz as a camp tragically misunderstood by history. According to Rolf, his father displayed total impermeability to any moral questioning, expressing only resentment for having been unjustly persecuted and forced to live in hiding. Reflecting on this chilling encounter, Rolf admitted the deep impact it had on him. He could not understand how his father could have committed such atrocities, declaring, "What happened is to me contrary to all ethics, all morality, and defies all understanding of human nature." Despite his disgust at his father's actions, Rolf could not betray him to the authorities, choosing to remain silent about Josef's South American whereabouts. After this transformative meeting, he changed his surname to his mother's, a symbolic act of rupture from the Mengele name. Wolf Rudiger Hess dedicated his life to defending the honor of his father, Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy. Born in 1937, Wolf was just a child when his father made his infamous solo flight to Scotland in 1941, supposedly to negotiate peace with Britain. In the 1950s, Wolf established the Committee to Free Rudolf Hess, claiming that his father had been a martyr for peace, unjustly imprisoned by Western powers who preferred to prolong the war against Germany. After Hess's death in prison in 1987, Wolf maintained that it resulted from foul play by his British captors, dedicating the next 20 years to promoting conspiracy theories about a supposed assassination. The rebellion of legacy, from tainted blood to the duty of memory. The process of transforming a traumatic inheritance into constructive action represents one of the most significant chapters in the history of the descendants of Nazi leaders. This metamorphosis emerged gradually, often after decades of internal conflict, personal research, and painful encounters with historical truth. Post-war German society was characterized by what historians have called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the process of confronting and coming to terms with the Nazi past. For the children of prominent perpetrators, this national process was inextricably intertwined with their personal identity struggles. While West Germany built a democratic identity deliberately opposed to the Third Reich, these descendants faced the parallel task of forging individual identities independent of their father's actions. The transition from the guilty silence of the 1950s and 60s to a more open confrontation with the Nazi past, catalyzed by events such as the Eichmann trial, 1961, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, 1963 to 1965, and the 1968 student movement, created a social context in which these descendants experienced increasing pressure to publicly position themselves regarding their parents' legacy. This climate of intergenerational questioning provided some with the opportunity to definitively break from family narratives of denial or justification. In this context, some descendants gradually developed a particular sensitivity toward the ethical and historical dimensions of Holocaust memory, recognizing their unique position not as a burden, but as a responsibility. These individuals not only acknowledged their parents' crimes, but transformed the traumatic weight of their inheritance into active engagement with historical memory and education. Monika Hertwig, daughter of Armin Goeth, commander of the Poiseau concentration camp immortalized in the film Schindler's List, exemplifies this transformative trajectory. Born in November 1945, Monika never met her father, who was executed when she was just 1 year old. During her childhood, her mother portrayed Goeth as a good family man and war hero, concealing the monstrous reality of his crimes. The defining moment in Monika's life came with the release of Schindler's List in 1993. Seeing her father portrayed as a sadistic murderer triggered an existential crisis. This initial shock evolved into a determined search for the truth, driving her to thoroughly research historical archives, interview camp survivors, and visit the sites where her father had committed crimes. In 2008, Monika took part in the documentary Inheritance, which documented her meeting with Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, a Jewish survivor who had been forced to serve as a maid in Goeth's villa during the war. This extraordinary dialogue between the perpetrator's daughter and her father's direct victim created a powerful testimony of reconciliation and mutual recognition. For Helen, who had endured daily abuse in Goeth's villa, the meeting with Monika represented a form of closing the circle. For Monica, it meant confronting the living embodiment of the suffering caused by her father. The climactic moment of their encounter occurred when both women, standing on the ruins of the villa where one had been tortured and the other conceived, embraced in a gesture that transcended the historical division between victims and perpetrators. Rainer Höss, grandson of Rudolf Höss, has followed a similar path of historical activism. Unlike his Aunt Brigitte, who chose anonymity and silence, Rainer has publicly embraced his complex family legacy. His awakening began during a school trip to the Dachau concentration camp, where he saw the name Höss on a plaque listing Nazi war criminals. In a symbolic act of rupture, Rainer severed ties with relatives who continued to hold poisonous ideologies and embarked on a mission to confront his grandfather's legacy. His work in Holocaust education has taken him to the very sites where his grandfather orchestrated unimaginable atrocities, speaking with survivors and listening to their stories. Rainer's authenticity was validated when, in 2009, he visited Auschwitz as a participant in an international Holocaust Congress. There, he was received with extraordinary generosity by elderly survivors who saw his presence as a powerful symbol of a break with the cycle of hatred. One of them, Marian Tursky, told him, "Your presence here, acknowledging your grandfather's crimes and working for memory, represents a final victory over the system Rudolf Höss helped implement." One of the most moving aspects of Rainer's work has been his effort to help return stolen possessions to descendants of Holocaust survivors. This endeavor has brought him face to face with the human cost of his grandfather's actions, confronting the tangible evidence of shattered lives and broken families. Katrin Himmler, great-niece of Heinrich Himmler, represents another significant case of constructive transformation of family legacy. Trained as a political scientist and historian, Katrin dedicated years to meticulously researching her own family history, culminating in the publication of The Himmler Brothers, 2005, a rigorous and brutally honest analysis of how three ordinary brothers, Ernst, Gebhard, and Heinrich, evolved toward National Socialism. The transformation of these descendants from guilty children to active witnesses represents a particularly powerful form of moral agency. Through their public testimony, educational contributions, and commitment to historical truth, these figures have turned inherited stigma into a platform for reconciliation and constructive memory. The shadow of the surname, faces and bodies that still bear the memory. Historical memory is inscribed not only in official documents and public monuments, but also in bodies, faces, and personal narratives that continue to inhabit the present. In contemporary Germany, while the physical remnants of the Third Reich have been largely eliminated or transformed, a human dimension of this history persists, one that cannot be demolished or legislated away, the living presence of descendants. This genetic and nominal inheritance constitutes a corporeal archive of historical memory that complicates any attempt to clearly delimit the Nazi past as a closed chapter of German history. Individuals who carry these emblematic surnames represent biological and cultural links to events that German society has meticulously worked to process and overcome. To understand the complexity of this physical persistence of the past, the case of Bettina Göring, great-niece of Hermann Göring, is illustrative. Born in 1956, Bettina grew up bearing a striking physical resemblance to her infamous great-uncle. The same facial structure, same eyes, even similar gestures according to those who knew her. This physical similarity made her a living reminder of a past German society was striving to move beyond. In an extreme act of rupture with this inescapable biological inheritance, Bettina chose to be voluntarily sterilized at the age of 30. "I didn't want to pass on these genes," she later explained. "I didn't want another Hermann Göring to potentially come from my bloodline." This radical act of genetic interruption illustrates the bodily dimension of Nazi inheritance, the feeling experienced by some descendants that they literally carry in their DNA the potential for evil. Though scientifically unfounded, this perception of tainted blood has influenced reproductive decisions for several descendants, revealing the most intimate and biological dimensions of this historical legacy. In a country where physical monuments to Nazism have been deliberately erased from the urban landscape, these descendants function as a form of embodied memory that challenges any neat separation between past and present. They carry surnames that act as invisible monuments to a traumatic past, inscribed not in stone but in identity documents, professional introductions, and personal relationships. This nominal burden has led to dramatic decisions of identity rupture. Edda Goering never married or had children, bearing her father's surname until her death in 2018 as a form of stubborn loyalty. In contrast, the 4 children of Albert Speer Jr. legally changed their last name after his death in 2017, thus breaking the nominal continuity with Hitler's architect. A grandson of Josef Mengele, living in Germany, uses a completely different surname and has built his professional and personal identity without any reference to his infamous grandfather. Jennifer Teague, granddaughter of Eamon Girth, represents a paradigmatic case of how this legacy can manifest unexpectedly, even generations later. Born to a German mother and Nigerian father and later adopted, Jennifer discovered her connection to Girth entirely by accident. At 38 years old, while browsing books in a Hamburg library, she came across one titled, "I Have to Love My Father, Don't I?" She recognized her biological mother on the cover and upon reading it discovered that her grandfather was the infamous commander of Poitou. This revelation triggered a profound identity crisis, made especially complex given that Jennifer had studied in Israel and maintained strong friendships with Jewish individuals. Her process of reconciling with this unexpected heritage, documented in her own book, My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me, illustrates how the Nazi past can erupt disruptively even when it seems to have faded. Jennifer's case adds an additional dimension to this complex inheritance, the intersection with racial identity. As an Afro-German woman, Jennifer would have been considered racially inferior under the very laws her grandfather enforced. This historical paradox, being both the biological descendant of a Nazi perpetrator and a member of a group persecuted by Nazi ideology, created additional layers of identity complexity that Jennifer would explore extensively in her later work as an educator and activist. The visual landscape of this inheritance is manifested in family photographs now held in historical archives. Images of smiling children playing in the gardens of Berchtesgaden, held in the arms of uniformed men, or innocently posing alongside figures now recognized as historical monsters. These photos, originally taken as private family keepsakes, have been recontextualized as historical artifacts, illustrating the unsettling domesticity that coexisted with genocidal machinery. The family albums of these descendants represent visual archives of historical dissociation. Irmgard Eichmann, widow of Adolf, meticulously preserved family photographs taken in Argentina, where they appeared as a typical family enjoying Sunday picnics or Christmas celebrations. These images of normalcy, captured while her husband lived clandestinely under a false identity after organizing the deportation of millions of Jews to extermination camps, illustrate the human capacity to compartmentalize and normalize even the most extreme biographies. Material objects also serve as tangible conduits of this legacy. The silver brooch, treasured by Gudrun Himmler, the stolen artworks that adorned Edda Goering's childhood rooms, the toys made by concentration camp prisoners that arrived as gifts in SS officers' homes. All of these objects carried a sinister history invisible to the children who possessed them. The intergenerational transfer of these objects carries deep ethical dilemmas for the descendants. When Rainer Höss discovered that one of his father's watches had originally belonged to a Jewish prisoner executed at Auschwitz, he donated the item to the camp museum as an act of symbolic restitution. In contrast, other descendants have privately sold similar items to collectors, a decision that has sparked ethical controversy over the monetization of Holocaust heritage. As the generation of biological children of Nazi leaders ages and gradually passes away, the voice of the third generation, the grandchildren of the architects of the Holocaust, is rising in prominence. This cohort, born mainly between the 1960s and 1980s, maintains a more distant but no less complex relationship with the Nazi family legacy. Their unique generational position, far enough removed to avoid direct guilt, but close enough to feel the weight of the surname, has produced distinctive approaches to this historical inheritance. Unlike their parents, the grandchildren grew up in a Germany that had already institutionalized confrontation with the Nazi past. For them, the question was not so much discovering and processing traumatic revelations about family crimes, information generally available since childhood, but developing identity strategies to integrate this knowledge into coherent autobiographies. As Rainer Hirsch expressed, "My parents had to discover and accept the unthinkable. We were born with that knowledge as part of our heritage. Our task is not so much discovery, but integration of that history into our lives." For most of these descendants, old age has brought a kind of provisional, though rarely complete, resolution. Recent photographs show faces marked by decades of internal struggle, eyes that have seen both unimaginable historical archives and the personal faces of survivors. Many have found purpose in educational or commemorative activities, transforming the burden of their surname into a responsibility toward historical memory. Others have found peace in deliberately ordinary lives, quietly contributing to a society their parents once tried to destroy. The shadow of the surname persists, but its meaning evolves. For the original generation of children, it represented a catastrophic rupture between privileged childhood and adult infamy. For their children and grandchildren, it has become a more distant yet enduring connection to a shared historical past. In the commemorative landscape of the 21st century, these figures occupy a unique and ambiguous space, neither perpetrators nor victims, but inherited witnesses whose personal lives are inextricably entwined with the historical memory of one of humanity's greatest moral catastrophes.